Namaste, Danava Pranam. By the instruction and grace of our spiritual master, Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Shripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj, we are here reading Srimad Bhagavatam. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Canto 3, the Status Quo, Chapter 26, Text 11. Panchabi Pancha Bir Brahma Chatur Bir Dasa Bistata Etach Chatur Vimshati Kam Ganam Pradhani Kam Vidu. The aggregate elements, namely the 5 gross elements, the 5 subtle elements, the 4 internal senses, the 5 senses for gathering knowledge, and the 5 outward organs of action, are known as the pradhana. Purport. According to Bhagavad Gita, the sum total of the 24 elements described herein is called the Yonir Mahad Brahma. The sum total of the living entities is impregnated into this Yonir Mahad Brahma, and they are born in different forms, beginning from Brahma down to the insignificant ant. In the Srimad Bhagavatam and other Vedic literatures, the sum total of the 24 elements, pradhana, is also described as Yonir Mahad Brahma. It is the source of the birth and subsistence of all living entities. Text 12. Mahabhutani panchaiva bor apognir marunabha tanmatrani chatavanti gandhanhini matani me. There are 5 gross elements, namely earth, water, fire, air, and ether. There are also 5 subtle elements: smell, taste, color, touch, and sound. 13. Indriyani dasashrotram svagdrigrasana nasika vakaro charano medram ayurdasama uchate. The senses for acquiring knowledge and the organs for action, number 10, namely the auditory sense, the sense of taste, the tactile sense, the sense of sight, the sense of smell, and the active organs for speaking, working, traveling, generating, and evacuating. 14. Mano buddhir ahankaras chitam ityantar atmakam Chaturdha lakshate bedo vritya lakshana rupaya. The internal subtle senses are experienced as having 4 aspects in the shape of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. Distinctions between them can be made only by different functions, since they represent different characteristics. Purport. The 4 internal senses, or subtle senses, described herein are defined by different characteristics. When pure consciousness is polluted by material contamination, and when identification with the body becomes prominent, one is said to be situated under false ego. Consciousness is the function of the soul, and therefore behind consciousness there is soul. Consciousness polluted by material contamination is called lahankara. Text 15. Etavan eva sankyato brahmana sagunasyaha sanivesho maya prokto yakala pancha vimshaka. All these are considered the qualified Brahman. The mixing element, which is known as time, is counted as the 25th element. Purport. According to the Vedic version, there is no existence beyond Brahman. Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. From the Chandogya Upanishad 3.14.1. It is stated also in the Vishnu Purana that whatever we see is Parasya Brahmana Shakti. Everything is an expansion of the energy of the Supreme Absolute Truth, Brahman. When Brahman is mixed with three qualities, goodness, passion, and ignorance, there results the material expansion, which is sometimes called Saguna, Brahman, and which consists of these 25 elements. In the Nirguna Brahman, there is no material contamination, or in the spiritual world, the three modes, goodness, passion, and ignorance, are not present. Where Nirgun Brahman is found, simple, unalloyed goodness prevails. Sagun Brahman is described by the Sankhya system of philosophy as consisting of 25 elements, including the time factor, present, past, present, and future. Text 16. Prabhavam Purusham Prahu Kalam Eke Yato Bayam Ahankara Vimudhasya Kartu Prakritim Iyusa. The influence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is felt in the time factor, which causes fear of death due to the false ego of the deluded soul who has contacted material nature. Purport. The living entity's fear of death is due to his false ego of identifying with the body. Everyone is afraid of death. Actually, there is no death for the spirit soul, but due to our absorption in the identification of body as self, the fear of death develops. It is also stated in Srimad Bhagavatam 11.2.37, Vayam dvitya binishveshta syat. Vayam dvitya biniveshata syat. Dvitiya refers to matter, which is beyond spirit. Matter is the secondary manifestation of spirit, for matter is produced from spirit. Just as the material elements described are caused by the Supreme Lord, or the Supreme Spirit, the body is also a product of the spirit soul. Therefore, the material body is called Dvitiya, or the second. One who is absorbed in this second element, or second exhibition of the spirit, is afraid of death. When one is fully convinced that he is not his body, there is no question of fearing death, since the spirit soul does not die. If the spirit soul engages in the spiritual activities of devotional service, he is completely freed from the platform of birth and death. His next position is complete spiritual freedom from a material body. The fear of death is the action of the kala, or the time factor, which represents the influence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In other words, time is destructive. Whatever is created is subject to destruction and dissolution, which is the action of time. Time is a representation of the Lord, and it reminds us also that we must surrender unto the Lord. The Lord speaks to every conditioned soul as time. He says in Bhagavad Gita that if someone surrenders unto him, then there is no longer any problem of birth and death. We should therefore accept the time factor as the Supreme Personality of Godhead standing before us. This is further explained in the following verse. 17. Prakritir guna samyasya nirvisheshasya manvani nirvisheshasya manavi chestayata sa bhagavan kala ityupalakshita. My dear mother, O daughter of Svayambhuva Manu, the time factor, as I have explained, is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whom the creation begins as a result of the agitation of the neutral, unmanifested nature. Purport. The unmanifested state of material nature, pradhana, is being explained. The Lord says that when the unmanifested material nature is agitated by the glance of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, it begins to manifest itself in different ways. Before this agitation, it remains in the neutral state without interaction by the three modes of material nature. In other words, material nature cannot produce any variety of manifestations without the contact of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This is very nicely explained in Bhagavad Gita. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is the cause of the products of material nature. Without his contact, material nature cannot produce anything. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita also, a very suitable example is given in this connection. Although the nipples on a goat's neck appear to be breast nipples, they do not give milk. Similarly, material nature appears to the material scientist to act and react in a wonderful manner. But in reality, it cannot act without the agitator, time, who is the representation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. When time agitates the neutral state of material nature begins to produce varieties of manifestations. Ultimately, it is said that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the cause of creation. As a woman cannot produce children unless impregnated by a man, material nature cannot produce or manifest anything unless it is impregnated by the Supreme Personality of Godhead in the form of the time factor. Text 18. Anta Purusha Rupena Kala Rupena Yobahi Samanvetyesha Sattvanam Bhagavan Atma Mayaya. By exhibiting his potencies, the Supreme Personality of Godhead adjusts all these different elements, keeping himself within as the Supersoul and without as time. Purport. Here it is stated that within the heart of the Supreme Personality of Godhead resides the Supersoul. Here it is stated that within the heart, the Supreme Personality of Godhead resides as the Supersoul. This situation is also explained in Bhagavad Gita. The Supersoul rests beside the individual soul and acts as a witness. This is also confirmed elsewhere in the Vedic literature. Two birds are sitting on the same tree of the body. One is witnessing and the other is eating the fruits of the tree. This Purusha, or Paramatma, who resides within the body of the individual soul, is described in Bhagavad Gita 13.23 as the Upadrashta, witness, and the Anumanta, sanctioning authority. The conditioned soul engages in the happiness and distress of the particular body given him by the arrangement of the external energy of the Supreme Lord. But the Supreme Living Being, or the Paramatma, is different from the conditioned soul. He is described in Bhagavad Gita as Maheshvara, or the Supreme Lord. He is Paramatma, not Jivatma. Paramatma means the Supersoul, who is sitting by the side of the conditioned soul just to sanction his activities. The conditioned soul comes to this material world in order to lord it over material nature. Since one cannot do anything without the sanction of the Supreme Lord, he lives with the Jiva soul as witness and sanction giver. He is also Bhokta. He gives maintenance and sustenance to the conditioned soul. Since the living entity is constitutionally part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Lord is very affectionate to the living entities. Unfortunately, when the living entity is bewildered or illusioned by the external energy, he becomes forgetful of his eternal relationship with the Lord. But as soon as he becomes aware of his constitutional position, he is liberated. The minute independence of the conditioned soul is exhibited by his marginal position. If he likes, he can forget the Supreme Personality of Godhead and come into the material existence with a false ego to lord it over material nature. But if he likes, he can turn his face to the service of the Lord. The individual living entity is given that independence. His conditional life is ended and his life becomes successful as soon as he turns his face to the Lord. But by misusing his independence, he enters into material existence. Yet the Lord is so kind that as supersoul, he always remains with the conditioned soul. The concern of the Lord is neither to enjoy nor to suffer from the material body. He remains with the jiva simply as sanction giver and witness so that the living entity can receive the results of his activities, good or bad. Outside the body of the conditioned soul, the Supreme Personality of Godhead remains as the time factor. According to the Sankhya system of philosophy, there are 25 elements. The 24 elements already described plus the time factor make 25. According to some learned philosophers, the supersoul is included to make a total of 26 elements. And thus ends our reading for today. We'll continue from text 19 on Friday. Jai Vishnupad Paramahamsa Shripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Srila Prabhupada, Srila Guru Maharaj, Srila Gurudev, Srila Acharya Dev, Srila Shanta Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Rupanuga Guru Varga Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the worldwide devotees. Sama Bhaktiveda Vrinda Ki Jai. Jai Navadvip Dham Ki Jai, Nishringapali Dham Ki Jai, Mayapur Dham Ki Jai. Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai, Baladev Subhadra Jagannath Ju Ki Jai. Ganga Mai, Muna Mai Ki Jai, Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai, Giri Govardhan Gupta Govardhan Dham Ki Jai. Shankund Radhakund Ki Jai, Tulsi Devi, Bhakti Devi, Vrinda Devi Ki Jai. Jai Harinam Sankirtan Yagi Ki Jai, Scientific Sankirtan Yagi Ki Jai. Jai Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Jai Princeton Bhakti Vedanta Institute Ki Jai, Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Institute Ki Jai, Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Mat Ki Jai. Nitai Gaur Premanandi Hari 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 Bol. Jai Srimati Uma Devi Dasi Ki Jai. Hare Krishna. Dhanavastidi.